Picture a moment 2,400 years ago. A Greek philosopher named Democritus stands at the edge of the Mediterranean, watching waves break against rock. He proposes something radical, something that will echo through millennia. Everything you see, everything you experience, your thoughts at this very moment are nothing more than atoms moving in void. No gods orchestrating from above, no spirits animating flesh, no cosmic mind thinking reality into being. Just matter, bumping and swerving through infinite space. This is materialism. And it represents perhaps the most consequential philosophical bet ever made about the nature of existence. Today we call someone materialistic when they chase possessions, when they measure life in accumulated things. But philosophical materialism makes a far bolder, far stranger claim. It says that matter is all there is, that consciousness, love, mathematics, the sensation of red, the feeling of existing at all, every aspect of reality emerges from, reduces to, or supervenes upon the physical. Think about what this means. Right now, as you process these words, materialists claim that your understanding, your very sense of self, is electrochemical signals cascading through roughly 86 billion neurons. The you who feels like an inner witness, the experiencer behind your eyes, is not some separate ghostly entity, but the physical activity of 3 pounds of fatty tissue in your skull. For many, this feels immediately wrong. Our subjective experience seems so utterly different from objective matter that reducing one to the other appears absurd. How could mere stuff, particles obeying blind physical laws, ever produce the vivid redness of a sunset or the sharp bite of grief? Yet materialism has become the default metaphysics of modern science, and this dominance has profound implications for how we understand consciousness, free will, morality, meaning, and our place in the cosmos. But here is what makes materialism truly fascinating. It has never achieved final victory. Throughout its history, materialism has been suppressed, resurrected, refined, and challenged. From ancient atomists hiding their texts from religious authorities, to Enlightenment thinkers executed for suggesting humans are merely complex machines, to contemporary neuroscientists facing the hard problem of consciousness, materialism has always encountered resistance. This resistance comes not from ignorance or superstition alone. It emerges from genuine philosophical puzzles that materialism struggles to resolve. How does the wetware of the brain generate the what-it-is likeness of experience? How can physical processes ground mathematical truths or moral values? How can deterministic matter give rise to genuine agency? We will explore all of this, the ancient roots and modern expressions, the brilliant arguments and devastating critiques, the places where materialism explains with stunning clarity and the places where it seems to crack under pressure. We will trace how materialism evolved from a simple assertion that atoms exist into sophisticated contemporary forms with names like eliminative materialism, functionalism, and non-reductive physicalism. And we will do this without cherry-picking. The goal here is not to defend or attack materialism, but to understand it in full depth. To see why brilliant minds have embraced it and why equally brilliant minds have rejected it. To grasp the assumptions it makes, the reasoning chains it follows, and the implications that flow from accepting or denying its core claims. What you're about to encounter is not surface-level philosophy. This is a deep expedition into one of the fundamental questions humans can ask. What is the basic substance of reality? Part 1. The Ancient Gambit. The birth of materialism was an act of intellectual rebellion. 5 centuries before the Common Era, in the Greek colonies along what is now the Turkish coast, a handful of thinkers began asking a dangerous question. What if the world needs no divine explanation? What if there is no Olympian pantheon pulling strings, no cosmic intelligence designing butterflies and stars? What if everything, absolutely everything, can be explained by matter alone? Leucippus and his student Democritus developed atomism, the first systematic materialist philosophy. Their core insight was devastatingly simple. Reality consists of only 2 things, atoms and void. Atoms, they claimed, are tiny, indivisible, eternal particles that differ only in shape, size, and position. These atoms move through empty space, colliding, hooking together, and separating according to mechanical necessity. Everything else, every apparent property and quality, every colour and taste and texture, emerges from atomic arrangements. Democritus put it starkly. By convention, sweet is sweet. By convention, bitter is bitter. By convention, hot is hot. By convention, cold is cold. By convention, colour is colour. But in reality, there are atoms and the void. Think about the audacity of this claim. Democritus is saying that the sweetness of honey, which seems so real and immediate when you taste it, does not actually exist as sweetness in the honey itself. Instead, honey atoms have particular shapes that, when they strike your tongue atoms in specific ways, produce the sensation you call sweetness in your mind. The sweetness is not in the object, but in the atomic interaction. This was eliminativism before the term existed. Democritus eliminated most of experienced reality, declaring it mere convention, appearance, or as we might say today, illusion. Only atoms and their movements are genuinely real. But why did these ancient Greeks make such a radical move? What problem were they trying to solve? Earlier, Greek philosophers had struggled with the puzzle of change. Parmenides had argued that change is impossible because something cannot come from nothing. If X becomes Y, then either Y already existed, in which case no real change occurred, or Y came into existence from nothing, which is absurd. Therefore, Parmenides concluded, all change is illusion. Reality is a single, unchanging, eternal being. Atomism offered an elegant escape from this paradox. Change is real, but it consists merely in rearrangement. The atoms themselves never change, they are eternal and unchanging, but their configurations shift constantly. A tree grows not because atoms transform into tree stuff, but because tree-shaped arrangements of atoms expand by incorporating more atoms. When you die, your atoms do not perish but scatter, eventually forming new arrangements, perhaps soil, perhaps another organism. Nothing comes from nothing. Nothing truly begins or ends. There is only eternal rearrangement of eternal atoms. This explanatory power made atomism intellectually seductive. It explained change without invoking mystery. It explained diversity why things appear so different from one another by pointing to different atomic configurations. A single principle, atoms in motion, could account for the entire observable world. But atomism also meant abandoning teleology, the idea that nature acts for purposes. In the traditional Greek worldview, acorns grow into oak trees because they are actualizing their inherent potential, their natural end or purpose. The world is shot through with purpose and meaning. Atomism rejects this entirely. Acorns become oaks not because of any inherent purpose, but because atomic arrangements, under certain conditions, produce that outcome mechanically. There is no goal, no design, no meaning encoded in nature. Just atoms following necessary laws of motion. And here is where atomism becomes genuinely threatening to social order. If there are only atoms, then souls do not exist. When you die, your atoms disperse, and you cease to be. There is no afterlife, no divine judgment, no cosmic justice. The gods, if they exist at all, are made of atoms like everything else. They did not create the universe, they are products of it, and they have no interest in human affairs. Epicurus, who revived and developed atomism 3 centuries after Democritus, made this anti-religious implication explicit. His entire philosophical system aimed to free humans from fear of gods and death. Religion, Epicurus taught, is humanity's greatest source of misery because it fills us with groundless terror about punishment after death. Once you realize that death is mere atomic dispersal, that no conscious you survives to experience anything, fear evaporates. The Roman poet Lucretius, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, turned Epicurean atomism into magnificent verse in his work On the Nature of Things. He explicitly frames his project as crushing the monster religion. He writes that religion has committed countless atrocities, and humanity must be freed from superstitious dread. Lucretius describes a universe of infinite atoms falling through infinite void. Occasionally, atoms swerve unpredictably, the famous clinamen, breaking deterministic chains and allowing both for the formation of complex structures and for human free will. This atomic swerve was Epicurus's addition to Democritian atomism, and it served 2 purposes. First, it explained why atoms collide at all instead of falling forever in parallel. Second, it provided a physical basis for agency, suggesting that atomic behavior includes an element of genuine randomness that propagates upward into human choice. But Lucretius's universe remains fundamentally materialist. Everything is matter in motion. The soul is made of smooth, swift atoms. Thought is atomic motion in the brain atoms. Death is simply the soul atoms dispersing, like smoke in wind. For centuries, this materialist tradition was known primarily through hostile accounts by Plato and Aristotle. Both rejected atomism decisively. Plato believed that abstract forms, not material atoms, constituted ultimate reality. The perfect circle exists in a non-physical realm of forms, and physical circles are merely imperfect copies or shadows of that eternal form. Matter, for Plato, is the least real aspect of existence. Aristotle rejected both Platonic forms and Democritian atoms. He developed an alternative framework where substances are composites of matter and form, and where teleology, purposiveness, is real and fundamental. For Aristotle, to explain anything fully requires identifying its 4 causes, including its final cause, the purpose or goal it serves. A seed develops into a tree, because that is its natural telos, its inherent end. Strip away teleology, and you cannot truly explain why things happen as they do. Given that Plato and Aristotle became the dominant voices in Western philosophy, with Aristotle particularly influential in medieval Christianity, atomism spent centuries marginalized. It persisted as an underground tradition, whispered about but rarely openly defended. Then came the Christian Middle Ages, and materialism nearly vanished entirely. Christian theology required an immaterial soul that survives bodily death to face divine judgment. It required a God who created matter and transcends it. Materialism contradicted both core doctrines. Consequently, materialists faced not merely philosophical objections, but the threat of execution for heresy. Yet, even during Christianity's dominance, materialist ideas never fully died. They survived in Arabic philosophy, in certain Stoic texts, in medical treatises about the body, in underground manuscripts. And when Renaissance humanism sparked renewed interest in ancient texts, atomism returned. Pierre Gassendi, a 17th-century French priest and philosopher, attempted something extraordinary. He tried to reconcile Epicurean atomism with Christian theology. Gassendi accepted that matter consists of atoms moving in void. He accepted mechanical explanations for most natural phenomena, but he carved out an exception for the human soul, declaring it immaterial and divinely created. This was intellectually unstable. If mechanical atomic explanations suffice for everything else, why should the soul require special pleading? But Gassendi's compromise allowed atomism to be discussed openly again, without immediate charges of heresy. Thomas Hobbes, Gassendi's English contemporary, was less cautious. Hobbes pushed materialism further into psychology and politics. He argued that sensation consists of motions in the brain. He tried to explain imagination, memory, and desire as forms of internal motion. And he claimed that even social and political life can be understood mechanically, as individuals pursuing self-preservation according to natural laws. Hobbes did not fully resolve the mind problem, but he established that materialism could be applied systematically to mental and social phenomena, not just physics and biology. By the 18th century, materialism reached its most explicit Enlightenment form in French philosophy. Julien Offray de La Métrie published Man a Machine in 1748, arguing that humans are entirely material mechanisms. The soul, La Métrie insisted, is nothing but organized matter. Thought is simply what brains do. This was philosophical napalm. La Métrie was denouncing the very distinction between humans and machines. He was saying that conscious experience, moral agency, reason itself are mechanical processes. No divine spark, no immaterial mind, no special human exemption from natural law. Predictably, the book caused outrage. La Métrie was forced to flee France, then Holland. He eventually found refuge at the court of Frederick the Great in Prussia. Even fellow Enlightenment figures distanced themselves, worried that crude materialism would undermine morality and social order. Denis Diderot, another French materialist, was more circumspect publicly but equally radical in his private writings. Diderot explored the implications of materialism for consciousness, suggesting that even sensation might be a property of all matter, not just living organisms. This proto-panpsychism attempted to solve the puzzle of how dead inert matter could produce felt experience. If even the simplest particles have some minimal form of sensitivity, then human consciousness is not miraculously emerging from nothing but rather a highly complex organization of something present all along. But the French materialists faced a persistent objection. If humans are merely matter in motion, if all mental states are brain states, then morality becomes problematic. Without immaterial souls and divine judgment, what grounds moral obligation? If I am just a complex machine executing mechanical processes, how can I be held responsible for my actions? Responsibility seems to require the ability to have done otherwise, but in a purely material, deterministic universe, every event, including every choice, is determined by prior physical causes. Critics argued that materialism logically leads to moral nihilism. If everything is matter, then all your moral intuitions, your sense that cruelty is wrong, are merely neurons firing. There is no objective right or wrong, just atoms bumping. The materialists responded that morality need not depend on metaphysical foundations. Social cooperation, human flourishing, the avoidance of suffering, these can ground ethics without invoking souls or gods. But this response never fully satisfied critics, who continued to see materialism as corrosive to human dignity and moral seriousness. By the 19th century, materialism had spawned two major offspring. One was scientific materialism, the view that scientific method reveals reality to consist entirely of matter and energy obeying natural laws. The spectacular success of physics and chemistry, explaining phenomena once attributed to vital forces or divine intervention, seemed to vindicate this view. The other offspring was dialectical materialism, developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Marx inverted Hegel's idealist dialectic, which saw history as the unfolding of spirit or absolute idea. Marx declared that material conditions, specifically economic structures and class relations, drive historical change. For Marx, human consciousness is not some free-floating mental realm, but is shaped by material social relations. How you think, what seems obviously true to you, depends on your position within the economic system. Ruling ideas are the ideas of the ruling class because those who control material production also control intellectual production. This historical materialism became enormously influential, not because it provided detailed accounts of consciousness, but because it offered a comprehensive framework for understanding society, politics, and human development in materialist terms. Yet even as materialism gained scientific prestige, it kept encountering the same stubborn problem. Matter seems ontologically distinct from mind. You can describe brain states in third-person objective language, specifying neuron firing rates and neurotransmitter concentrations. But subjective experience, the what it feels like, resists this kind of description. No amount of objective data seems to capture what it is like to taste coffee or feel embarrassment. This is not mere ignorance about brain function. The problem is conceptual. Physical descriptions leave out precisely what makes consciousness conscious, the subjective, first-person, qualitative dimension. Ancient atomists did not fully appreciate this problem. Democritus could blithely declare that soul atoms are just unusually smooth and swift atoms, without recognizing how little this explains subjective experience. But by the 20th century, this problem could no longer be ignored. Materialism would need to evolve. It would need to become more sophisticated, more nuanced. It would need to develop new strategies for dealing with consciousness, intentionality, and normativity. And that evolution would produce some of the strangest and most counterintuitive philosophical positions ever seriously defended. Positions that deny the existence of beliefs. Positions that claim consciousness is an illusion. Positions that insist mental states are identical to brain states despite appearing utterly different. But before we enter that strange territory, we must understand what made ancient materialism so conceptually powerful. At its core was a single explanatory principle. Complexity emerges from simplicity. Apparent diversity arises from underlying uniformity. Everything, no matter how intricate or mysterious, is ultimately just atoms and void. Part 2. The Machine Awakens. By the 17th century, something extraordinary was happening. The mechanical worldview was conquering domain after domain. Galileo had shown that falling bodies obey mathematical laws. Descartes had reduced geometry to algebra. Harvey had demonstrated that the heart is a pump, circulation a mechanical system. Everywhere natural philosophers looked, they found that phenomena once attributed to mysterious vital forces or divine intervention could be explained mechanically. This was the birth of modern scientific materialism. The key insight was that nature operates like clockwork. Not metaphorically, but literally. The universe is a vast machine, its parts interlocking and moving according to precise mathematical laws. And if you could specify the positions and velocities of all particles at one moment, you could, in principle, predict the entire future and retrodict the entire past. Pierre-Simon Laplace, the great French mathematician, made this explicit in the 19th century. He imagined a vast intellect that knew the positions and momenta of every particle in the universe. For such an intellect, Laplace wrote, nothing would be uncertain, and the future, just like the past, would be present before its eyes. This is deterministic materialism in its purest form. The present physical state completely determines all future states. There is no spontaneity, no genuine novelty, no freedom. Everything that happens was already implicit in the initial conditions, plus the laws of motion. But here is what made this worldview simultaneously powerful and disturbing. It worked. Newton's laws predicted planetary motions with stunning accuracy. Chemistry discovered that substances combine in fixed proportions, suggesting underlying atomic structure. Thermodynamics revealed that heat is molecular motion, not some caloric fluid. Every success reinforced the mechanical materialist picture. Yet something was missing from this picture. Consciousness. Descartes had tried to solve this by splitting reality in two. Matter, he said, is one substance, defined by extension in space. Mind is another substance, defined by thought. The material world operates mechanically, but minds operate according to different principles entirely. This dualism allowed Descartes to be thoroughly mechanistic about physics and biology, while preserving human consciousness and free will as something special, something exempt from mechanical necessity. But dualism created more problems than it solved. If mind and matter are completely different kinds of substance, how do they interact? How does your immaterial decision to raise your arm cause material neurons to fire and material muscles to contract? How do material photons, striking your material retina, produce immaterial visual experience? Descartes lamely suggested they interact through the pineal gland. But this was no answer at all. The pineal gland is just more matter. Saying interaction happens there does not explain how interaction between fundamentally different substances is possible. The materialists saw dualism as a philosophical cop-out. Hobbes and Lamettrie argued that positing immaterial minds was unnecessary. If the brain is material and thoughts correlate with brain activity, why not simply identify thoughts with brain activity? Why multiply substances beyond necessity? This is the move that defines modern scientific materialism. Consciousness is not something separate from matter. It is what certain complex material systems do. The 19th century brought this argument new force. Physiologists began mapping the brain systematically. Paul Broca discovered that damage to a specific brain region eliminates the ability to produce speech. Carl Wernicke found that damage elsewhere eliminates speech comprehension. Specific mental functions correlated with specific brain regions. Then came the discovery that seemed to seal materialism's victory: evolution. Darwin's Origin of Species, in 1859, demonstrated that life's complexity arises through natural selection, a purely material process requiring no designer. Humans were not specially created, but evolved from simpler organisms through countless small modifications. This meant human consciousness, human rationality, human moral sense all evolved. They emerged gradually through material processes over millions of years. There was no moment when God inserted an immaterial soul into a hominid body. Consciousness developed the same way eyes and hands developed, through variations that enhanced survival and reproduction. Evolution made materialism about mind not just possible, but seemingly necessary. If consciousness evolved, it must be a material phenomenon. Natural selection cannot shape immaterial substances. It works through differential reproduction of organisms with different physical traits. For consciousness to be subject to evolutionary shaping, it must be physically instantiated. German materialism of the mid-1800s pushed this to its limit. Ludwig Büchner, Jakob Mohlschott and Carl Vogt declared that thought stands in the same relation to the brain as bile to the liver or urine to the kidneys. Thought is simply what brains secrete. This was crude, almost comically reductive, but it captured the spirit of 19th century scientific materialism. Mental phenomena are brain phenomena, period. Yet even as materialism seemed triumphant, problems multiplied. First, physics itself was undermining simple mechanical materialism. The discovery of electromagnetism revealed that matter and force are more complicated than simple atoms bumping. Fields, regions of space with potential energy, seemed ontologically distinct from particles. Then came quantum mechanics in the early 20th century, and suddenly matter itself became strange. At quantum scales, particles do not have definite positions and momenta simultaneously. They exist in superpositions of multiple states. Measurement somehow collapses these superpositions, but how measurement works and whether it requires consciousness remains disputed. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest that consciousness plays a fundamental role in physics. Others maintain that quantum effects average out at macroscopic scales and have no relevance to neuroscience. But, at minimum, quantum mechanics showed that matter is not the simple, solid, deterministic stuff that mechanical materialists imagined. Second, the problem of consciousness refused to go away. Yes, brain damage disrupts mental function. Yes, drugs alter consciousness. Yes, neural activity correlates with mental states. But correlation is not identity. Even if we map every neural correlate of every mental state, we still face an explanatory gap. Why should billions of neurons firing produce subjective experience at all? Why is there something it is like to be a brain processing visual information? Thomas Huxley, Darwin's great defender, recognized this problem. He suggested that consciousness might be an epiphenomenon, a byproduct of brain activity with no causal efficacy. Your conscious experiences exist, Huxley proposed, but they do not actually do anything. They are like the whistle on a steam locomotive, produced by the engine, but not affecting its motion. This epiphenomenalism satisfied no one. It made consciousness real but impotent. And it raised an evolutionary puzzle. If consciousness has no effects, why would natural selection produce it? Traits that do not affect survival and reproduction should not be selected for. Third, materialism struggled with mental content. Your thoughts are about things. Right now you have thoughts about materialism, about philosophy, about this script. This aboutness, this intentionality, seems fundamental to mental states. But how can purely physical states have intentionality? Brain states are just neurons firing. Neurons do not inherently mean anything or refer to anything. A pattern of neural activity is just that, a pattern. What makes it about Paris or democracy or your childhood? Some materialists tried to ground intentionality in causal relations. Perhaps a mental state is about X when it is caused by X in the right way. But this faces immediate problems. You can think about unicorns, but unicorns never cause brain states because they do not exist. You can think about the future, but future events cannot cause present brain states. Others tried to ground intentionality in functional relations. Perhaps a brain state is about X when it plays a certain role in the organism's behavior. But functional roles seem too coarse-grained. Different beliefs can play the same behavioral role, and the same belief can play different roles in different contexts. Fourth, materialism faced the problem of normativity. Some beliefs are true, others false. Some inferences are valid, others invalid. Some actions are right, others wrong. But if beliefs are just brain states, physical arrangements of matter, how can they be true or false? Truth seems to be a normative property, a way beliefs ought to be. Matter just is, it does not obey or violate norms. Similarly, if reasoning is just neurons firing according to causal laws, how can it be valid or invalid? Causation is not the same as logical implication. A belief might cause another belief without rationally supporting it. And moral properties seem especially resistant to materialist explanation. If humans are just matter, configured by evolution to survive and reproduce, then our moral intuitions are merely useful fictions. Natural selection shaped us to feel that murder is wrong because groups with such feelings cooperated better and outcompeted other groups. But that evolutionary explanation does not show that murder actually is wrong, only that we are built to believe it is. These problems meant that 20th century materialism could not simply repeat mechanical materialism. It needed to become more sophisticated. The solution was to focus less on what matter is and more on what matter does. This shift from substance to function would produce the dominant varieties of contemporary materialism. But before we examine those varieties, recognize what scientific materialism achieved. It established that consciousness depends on the brain. Destroy the brain, and consciousness ceases. Alter brain chemistry, and consciousness changes. This dependency is not some philosophical speculation, but empirical fact. Materialism also unified our understanding of nature. Instead of separate realms, physical and mental, with mysterious interactions, we have one realm. This ontological parsimony is intellectually satisfying. It means biology reduces to chemistry, chemistry reduces to physics, and in principle everything is physics. This unity makes science possible. If mental phenomena operated according to completely different principles than physical phenomena, systematic scientific study of consciousness would be impossible. But if consciousness is a physical phenomenon, then neuroscience can study it the same way physics studies motion. Yet unity came at a cost. It meant rejecting much that humans find meaningful. If everything is matter, then free will is illusion. Moral responsibility becomes problematic. Purpose and meaning must be constructed, not discovered. The universe cares nothing for human values. This was the great wager of scientific materialism: trade mystery and meaning for explanatory power and empirical adequacy. Whether that trade succeeds depends on whether materialism can solve its remaining puzzles. And that brings us to contemporary philosophy of mind, where materialism fragments into competing sophisticated versions. Part 3. The Many Faces of Matter. By the mid-20th century, materialism faced a choice: either solve the consciousness problem or abandon the project. The result was an explosion of creativity. Materialists developed multiple strategies for dealing with mind, each with its own costs and benefits. These contemporary varieties of materialism differ dramatically from each other, sometimes more than they differ from dualism. Let us map this conceptual territory. The simplest strategy is identity theory, also called reductive materialism or type physicalism. This view, defended by J.J.C. Smart and U.T. Place in the 1950s, makes a bold claim. Mental states are identical to brain states, not correlated with, not caused by, not realized in, but identical to. Pain, for example, is identical to C-fiber firing. The sensation of red is identical to a specific pattern of activity in visual cortex. Believing it will rain is identical to some neural configuration. This identity is supposed to be like the identity between water and H2O. We discovered empirically that water just is H2O. It is not that water is made of H2O or that H2O causes water. Water is H2O. They are one thing with two names. Similarly, identity theorists claim we will discover empirically that pain just is C-fiber firing. Mental state terms and brain state terms refer to the same underlying reality. This has attractive simplicity. If mental states are brain states, then there is no mystery about how they interact. There is no interaction. There is just one thing viewed from two perspectives. It also explains why mental states depend on brain states. Of course, altering the brain alters consciousness, because consciousness is brain activity. But identity theory faces devastating objections. First, mental states and brain states have different properties. Pain feels a certain way. It has a qualitative character. C-fiber firing does not feel like anything. It is just neurons sending signals. If pain and C-fiber firing are identical, they should have all the same properties, but they seem to have completely different properties. Identity theorists respond that this is an epistemic difference, a difference in how we know about them, not a real difference. When you introspect pain, you access the same state that neuroscientists access when they measure C-fibers, just through a different route. But this response feels forced. The felt quality of pain seems genuinely different from neural firing, not just known differently. Second, identity theory faces the multiple realizability objection. This objection, pressed by Hilary Putnam, became enormously influential. If pain is identical to C-fiber firing, then only organisms with C-fibers can feel pain. But surely organisms with very different nervous systems, octopuses, birds, perhaps even aliens or sophisticated robots, could feel pain. Their pain would be realized in different physical substrates. An octopus's pain might be identical to some completely different neural process. This suggests that pain is not identical to any specific physical state. Instead, pain is a functional state, something defined by its causal role rather than its physical composition. This leads to functionalism, the dominant view in contemporary philosophy of mind. Functionalism says mental states are defined by what they do, not what they are made of. Pain, for instance, is whatever state is typically caused by tissue damage, causes distress and avoidance behavior, and causes beliefs like "I am in pain." Anything that plays that causal role is pain, regardless of its physical implementation. C-fiber firing realizes pain in humans. Some other physical process realizes pain in octopuses. Silicon circuits might realize pain in future robots. This makes functionalism materialist yet flexible. Mental states are still physical states. They must be physically realized somehow. But the same mental state can be realized in multiple different physical ways. Functionalism draws an analogy with computation. The same program can run on different hardware. Microsoft Word running on a Mac and Microsoft Word running on a PC are the same software despite different physical implementations. Similarly, the same mental state can run on different wetware. This computational theory of mind became dominant from the 1960s onward. The brain is hardware, the mind is software. Mental states are computational states. Thinking is information processing. Functionalism elegantly solves the multiple realizability problem. It also explains how mental states can have causal powers. Mental states are defined by their causal roles, so of course they cause things. But functionalism faces its own devastating objection, the absent qualia problem. Imagine a system that is functionally identical to you. It responds to tissue damage the same way, produces the same avoidance behaviors, the same reports of pain. But internally, there is nothing it is like to be this system. The lights are off. It is a philosophical zombie, functionally equivalent to a conscious being, but lacking any inner experience. If such a zombie is conceivable, then functional role cannot fully capture consciousness. What matters about pain is not just its causal role, but its felt quality, its phenomenology. And functionalism seems to leave that out entirely. Functionalists respond that zombies are not genuinely conceivable, that once you specify all the functional details, consciousness comes for free. But many philosophers find zombies obviously conceivable, and the debate remains unresolved. A third variety of materialism takes a more radical approach. Eliminative materialism, defended by Paul and Patricia Churchland, argues that our ordinary mental state concepts are simply false. Folk psychology, our everyday framework for understanding minds, talks about beliefs, desires, fears, hopes. But eliminativists claim this framework is a false theory, like phlogiston theory in chemistry or vitalism in biology. Science progresses by eliminating false posits. We do not try to reduce phlogiston to modern chemistry. We eliminate it, declaring it never existed. Similarly, eliminativists predict mature neuroscience will eliminate beliefs and desires. We will stop talking about what people believe and instead describe their neural states directly. This sounds absurd. Surely I have beliefs. I believe you are reading this script. I believe materialism is philosophically important. How could eliminativists deny such obvious facts? But eliminativists argue that folk psychology makes empirical predictions that keep failing. It predicts that similar beliefs produce similar behaviors, but they do not. It assumes beliefs and desires are discrete states with clear boundaries, but neural activity is continuously variable. It treats mental content as precise and determinate, but content often seems vague and context-dependent. Moreover, mature sciences typically do not preserve folk ontologies. Physics eliminated many common-sense concepts. Folk biology said species are fixed essences, but evolution showed species are arbitrary divisions in continuous lineages. Why should folk psychology fare better? A particularly radical version of eliminative materialism targets consciousness itself. Illusionism, defended by Daniel Dennett and Keith Frankish, claims that phenomenal consciousness, the what-it-is likeness of experience, is an illusion. This seems even more absurd than eliminating beliefs. The one thing I know with certainty is that I am conscious. How could consciousness be an illusion? To have an illusion, you must be conscious of the illusion. But illusionists clarify. They do not deny that we are conscious in the sense of being awake, responsive, capable of sophisticated processing. They deny that consciousness has the special qualitative properties we think it has. When you see red, you think there is a special redness quality in your experience. Illusionists claim this is a misrepresentation. Your brain represents itself as having phenomenal properties, but this self-representation is inaccurate. There is processing of visual information, but no irreducible qualia. Think of it like a magic trick. The magician does not actually saw the assistant in half. But your visual system represents the scene as sawing in half. Similarly, your introspective system represents your experience as having phenomenal properties, but this representation is mistaken. Illusionism solves the hard problem by denying there is anything to solve. If phenomenal consciousness does not exist, then we do not need to explain how matter produces it. Critics respond that illusionism is self-refuting. If consciousness is an illusion, who or what is experiencing the illusion? Consciousness is precisely the kind of thing that cannot be illusory, because the appearance of consciousness is consciousness. This criticism, the Moorean argument, says that the reality of consciousness is more certain than any philosophical theory that denies it. We should reject the theory, not consciousness. At the opposite extreme from eliminative materialism is non-reductive materialism or non-reductive physicalism. This view, associated with Donald Davidson and Jaegwon Kim, accepts that mental states are physical, but denies that they reduce to physical states. Mental properties supervene on physical properties. This means you cannot change mental properties without changing physical properties. But mental properties are not identical to physical properties. They are higher-level properties that emerge from physical configurations. Think of liquidity. Water is liquid at room temperature. Liquidity supervenes on molecular properties. You cannot change liquidity without changing how molecules interact. But liquidity is not identical to any specific molecular property. It is an emergent feature of how many molecules interact. Similarly, consciousness might supervene on brain states without reducing to them. Once you fix all the physical facts, you fix all the mental facts. But mental vocabulary captures patterns and properties that physical vocabulary misses. Non-reductive materialism seems to have its cake and eat it too. It is materialist because everything physical determines everything mental. But it is not reductive, so it avoids the explanatory gap problem. The cost is that mental causation becomes mysterious again. If mental properties do not reduce to physical properties, how do they cause anything? Physical causation is complete. Every physical event has a sufficient physical cause. So where is there room for mental properties to do causal work? Kim's exclusion argument presses this point. If physical properties already causally explain behavior, mental properties are causally redundant. And if they are redundant, they are epiphenomenal. Non-reductive materialism collapses back into the problem it tried to avoid. Each variety of materialism makes different trade-offs. Identity theory preserves causal efficacy, but struggles with multiple realizability. Functionalism handles multiple realizability but seems to miss qualia. Eliminative materialism dissolves problems by denying their reality, but seems to deny the undeniable. Non-reductive materialism preserves mental reality but makes causation mysterious. This fragmentation reveals something important. Materialism is not a single unified doctrine, but a family of positions sharing a core commitment. That core commitment is physicalism, the thesis that everything is physical or supervenes on the physical. But what does physical mean? In ancient atomism, physical meant made of atoms and void. In mechanical materialism, physical meant subject to mechanical laws. In contemporary physics, physical includes quantum fields, curved space-time, dark matter, dark energy, things far stranger than anything materialists initially imagined. Some philosophers define physicalism as the view that everything is as physics says it is. But this makes physicalism dependent on future physics. If physics changes dramatically, as it has repeatedly, then what counts as physical changes too. Others define physicalism negatively. Physical means not mental, not spiritual, not supernatural. But this is circular when trying to understand whether mentality is physical. The truth is that materialism has become conceptually slippery. It no longer means anything precise. Instead, it names a family resemblance among positions that reject dualism and supernatural causation, while maintaining that science can ultimately explain everything. This vagueness is both a weakness and a strength. A weakness because it makes materialism hard to refute. Whenever a problem arises, materialists can tweak their position, moving from identity theory to functionalism to eliminativism as needed. But also a strength, because it makes materialism adaptable. As science discovers new phenomena and new explanatory frameworks, materialism evolves. The question is whether any version of materialism can solve the deepest problem, the problem of consciousness. Part 4. The Abyss of Experience. There is a difference between explaining how a brain processes information and explaining why processing information feels like anything at all. This is the hard problem of consciousness, and it threatens to sink materialism entirely. David Chalmers crystallized this problem in 1995, though philosophers had recognized it for decades. He distinguished easy problems from the hard problem. The easy problems concerned functional mechanisms. How does the brain integrate information? How does it discriminate stimuli? How does it control behavior? These are empirical questions. They are difficult technically, but they are in principle solvable. Build a sufficiently detailed model of neural mechanisms and you explain these functions. But the hard problem asks why these functions are accompanied by experience. Why is there something it is like to see red rather than just neural processing of wavelength information? Why does pain hurt rather than just trigger avoidance responses? Why is consciousness not just in the dark? Functional explanations seem to leave this out entirely. You could specify every functional property of the brain, every input-output relation, every information processing step, and it would still be an open question whether there is anything it is like to be that brain. This explanatory gap is not mere ignorance. It is conceptual. Physical descriptions specify objective third-person properties. Conscious experience is subjective, first-person. And there seems to be no way to derive the subjective from the objective. Frank Jackson's knowledge argument makes this vivid. Imagine Mary, a brilliant scientist who knows everything physical about color vision. She knows every fact about wavelengths, photoreceptors, neural pathways, functional roles, but Mary has lived her entire life in a black and white room. She has never seen colours. One day, Mary leaves the room and sees red for the first time. Does she learn something new? It seems obvious that she does. She learns what it is like to see red. But if physicalism is true, Mary already knew all the physical facts. So there must be non-physical facts. Facts about what experiences are like that cannot be derived from physical facts. Physicalists have generated many responses. Some argue that Mary does not learn new facts, but merely acquires new abilities, the ability to recognize and imagine red. Others argue that Mary's new knowledge is the same physical facts known in a new way, through direct experience rather than description. But these responses struggle to capture the intuition that phenomenal knowledge is genuinely different. Knowing that pain involves C fibers is not the same as feeling pain. And the difference seems to be more than just a difference in how the same fact is known. The zombie argument presses this point further. Imagine a physical duplicate of you, atom for atom identical. But this duplicate is not conscious. Internally, it is dark. There is nothing it is like to be this zombie. Yet the zombie behaves exactly like you. It responds to pain stimuli, reports being in pain, seems to think and reason. But it is just a sophisticated automaton, processing information without experience. If such zombies are conceivable, even if not actually possible, then consciousness is not logically entailed by physical facts. And if consciousness is not logically entailed by physical facts, then consciousness is not physical. Chalmers uses this to argue for property dualism. Physical properties explain structure and function. But phenomenal properties, the qualitative fields of experience, are additional properties not reducible to physical properties. This does not mean souls or spirits. Chalmers is a naturalist. He thinks consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality, like mass or charge, that requires its own laws linking it to physical processes. But other philosophers argue that zombie conceivability proves nothing. Daniel Dennett insists that zombies are not genuinely conceivable. Once you specify all the functional details, consciousness necessarily follows. The supposed zombie would actually be conscious, because consciousness just is that functional organization. This dispute about conceivability reveals a deep methodological divide. Some philosophers trust intuitions about conceivability as evidence about possibility. Others regard such intuitions as unreliable, shaped by conceptual confusion. Another argument against materialism targets qualia directly. Qualia are the intrinsic qualitative properties of experiences. The redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the sweetness of sugar. These properties seem subjective, private, and ineffable. Only you can directly access your own qualia. No one else can know exactly what your experience of red is like, and you cannot fully describe that experience to someone who has never seen colour. But physical properties are objective, public, and describable. Anyone can measure neural firing rates. The same neural state can be detected by different instruments. Physical descriptions are communicable using mathematical language. This mismatch between subjective qualia and objective physics suggests they are different kinds of properties, and if they are different kinds of properties, materialism is false. Materialists have two main responses. Some, like Dennett, deny that qualia exist as usually conceived. Yes, there are differences in how things seem, but these differences are functional, not ineffable. What you call the redness of red is just how your visual system represents wavelength information, plus judgments and reactive dispositions. Strip away the confused metaphysics, and nothing remains that needs explaining. Others accept qualia, but argue they are physical properties known through direct introspection. When you introspect the redness of red, you are directly accessing a neural property. The apparent subjectivity comes from the mode of access, not the nature of the property accessed. Neither response fully satisfies critics. The denial of qualia seems to deny the obvious. And the claim that qualia are neural properties seems to misdescribe experience. When I introspect pain, I do not seem to be accessing neural firing. I seem to be accessing something qualitatively different. The hard problem connects to another puzzle, the unity of consciousness. Your experience at any moment is unified. You simultaneously see colours, hear sounds, feel textures, think thoughts, and these are not separate, isolated experiences. They are aspects of one unified phenomenal field, but the brain is spatially distributed. Visual processing happens in occipital cortex, auditory processing in temporal cortex, motor control in frontal regions. Different neurons fire in different locations. So how does the brain bind all this distributed activity into unified experience? This is the binding problem. Materialists propose various solutions. Perhaps neural synchrony, neurons firing in coordinated rhythms, binds features into unified percepts. Perhaps global workspace theories are right. Consciousness arises when information becomes globally accessible throughout the brain. But critics argue that these proposals explain, at best, neural binding, not phenomenal binding. Explaining how information is integrated functionally does not explain why integration feels unified. Then there is the problem of self-awareness. You are not merely conscious of the world, you are conscious of being conscious. You have a sense of yourself as a continuing subject of experience. Higher-order theories of consciousness propose that consciousness requires higher-order representations. A mental state is conscious when monitored by a higher-order state. I am conscious of pain when I have a thought about my pain. But this seems to push the problem back. The higher-order thought is itself a mental state. What makes it conscious? Do we need a third-order thought about the second-order thought? Ad infinitum. Perhaps most troubling for materialism is the explanatory gap between neural descriptions and phenomenal descriptions. Joseph Levine pointed out that even if we identify mental states with brain states, we lack a satisfying explanation of why those identifications hold. We understand why water is H2O. The macro properties of water, its fluidity, its boiling point, follow from H2O's molecular structure plus chemical laws. We can derive the macro from the micro, but we cannot derive redness from neural firing patterns. Even complete neuroscience would leave a gap. We would know all the neural facts, but we would not understand why those neural facts feel like anything. Some philosophers argue this gap is merely epistemic, a limit of our understanding, not a metaphysical divide. Others insist the gap reflects genuine metaphysical distinctness. The hard problem has driven some former materialists to alternative views. Thomas Nagel argues that materialism is probably false. Consciousness seems to require something beyond physical properties, though we do not yet know what. Colin McGinn suggests that humans might be cognitively closed to the solution. Just as rats cannot understand quantum mechanics, we might lack the concepts to grasp how matter produces consciousness. Galen Strawson proposes panpsychism. Perhaps consciousness is not produced by matter, but is a fundamental feature of matter itself. Even elementary particles have some minimal form of experience. Human consciousness is not matter becoming conscious, but matter organizing consciousness that was there all along. Materialism has not solved these problems. It has produced sophisticated strategies for managing them, but not definitive solutions. Some materialists embrace Mysterianism. We do not currently understand consciousness, but that is okay. Physics once could not explain heat, then discovered it is molecular motion. Similarly, future neuroscience will explain consciousness as neural dynamics. Others embrace eliminativism. If consciousness cannot be explained materialistically, then our concept of consciousness is confused. We should eliminate or radically revise that concept. But critics respond that consciousness is not like phlogiston. We can be wrong about external objects. But we cannot be wrong about whether we are conscious. The appearance of consciousness is consciousness. Here is what makes the hard problem so treacherous for materialism. It is not just one problem among many. It strikes at the heart of the materialist project. Materialism's great advantage is its explanatory unity. One kind of stuff, matter, governed by natural laws, explains everything. But if consciousness is genuinely irreducible, if no amount of physical explanation captures phenomenality, then that unity fractures. You are left with physical facts plus phenomenal facts, with no bridge between them. And at that point, materialism has failed. Whether materialism has actually failed depends on whether the hard problem has a solution. But centuries of materialist philosophy have not produced one. The abyss of experience remains, and it threatens to swallow materialism whole. Part 5. History's Material Footprint. While analytic philosophers debated consciousness, another materialist tradition was transforming politics and economics. Dialectical materialism. Karl Marx was not primarily interested in the metaphysics of mind. His materialism targeted history and society. And his central claim was radical. Human consciousness, culture, politics, morality, religion, all emerge from material economic conditions. Marx inherited the Hegelian dialectic, the idea that history progresses through contradiction and resolution. But whereas Hegel saw history as spirit realizing itself, Marx inverted this. History is not ideas shaping matter. History is matter shaping ideas. The foundation is economic. Humans must produce to survive. They must transform nature, extract resources, create tools, organize labor. This mode of production, the specific way a society organizes economic activity, determines everything else. In feudalism, the mode of production centered on agricultural land controlled by aristocrats. Serfs worked the land, produced surplus for lords, remained legally bound to estates. This economic structure generated a corresponding ideological superstructure. Feudal culture emphasized hierarchy, divine right, honor, duty. These ideas legitimized and reinforced the economic base. But modes of production contain internal contradictions. Feudalism developed market towns, merchant classes, new forms of wealth. The bourgeoisie, initially subordinate to aristocracy, accumulated capital and demanded political power. Eventually, contradictions exploded. Revolution. Feudalism gave way to capitalism. Capitalism's mode of production centers on wage labor and capital accumulation. Workers sell labor power to capitalists who own means of production. This generates enormous productivity, but also exploitation. Workers produce more value than they receive in wages. Capitalists appropriate this surplus value as profit. Capitalism, too, has internal contradictions. Competition forces capitalists to maximize profit by minimizing wages and intensifying labor. But this immiserates workers, who eventually organize, resist, and overthrow the system. Capitalism creates its own gravediggers, the proletariat. According to Marx, history moves through stages: ancient slave economies, feudalism, capitalism, eventually socialism and communism. Each transition occurs when productive forces, technology and organization outgrow existing property relations. This is historical materialism, not metaphysical materialism about atoms and brains, but social materialism about economics and power. The key insight is that ideas are not autonomous. What you believe about justice, freedom, human nature reflects your class position. Ruling ideas are the ideas of the ruling class. Those who control material production also control intellectual production. Take the concept of freedom. Under feudalism, freedom meant freedom from arbitrary seizure, protection of customary rights. Under capitalism, freedom means freedom to contract, to sell labor, to own property. These are not neutral definitions. They reflect and justify existing power structures. Or consider religion. Marx famously called religion the opium of the people. Not because religious people are stupid, but because religion serves an ideological function. It promises compensation in an afterlife for suffering in this life. It tells the exploited to accept their lot, that the meek will inherit the earth. This makes oppression tolerable, diffusing revolutionary potential. Engels elaborated dialectical materialism in works like Dialectics of Nature. He extended materialist analysis beyond human society to natural processes. All of nature operates dialectically. through contradictions and transformations. Quantity transforms into quality. Things contain their own negation. Development proceeds through conflict. Water heated continuously remains liquid until reaching a critical threshold, then abruptly transforms to vapor. Quantitative change, temperature increase, produces qualitative change, phase transition. Similarly, capitalism accumulates quantitative contradictions, wealth concentration, worker immiseration, economic crises, until a qualitative transformation occurs. Revolution. Dialectical materialism became the official philosophy of Soviet communism. Vladimir Lenin systematized it in materialism and empirio-criticism. Joseph Stalin codified it in dialectical and historical materialism. Mao Zedong applied it to Chinese conditions. But Soviet dialectical materialism became rigid, dogmatic, divorced from Marx's original critical spirit. It declared materialism scientifically proven, dialectics the universal law of nature. Any dissent was bourgeois idealism, counter-revolutionary thought. This dogmatism discredited dialectical materialism in the West. Combined with the Soviet Union's collapse, it seemed to prove that Marxist materialism was fundamentally flawed. Yet Marx's core insights remain powerful. First, material conditions profoundly shape consciousness. This is not crude determinism. Ideas have autonomy and causal efficacy, but ideas arise in material contexts. They reflect interests, experiences, social positions. Contemporary sociology confirms this. Your socio-economic background predicts your political views, moral intuitions, even aesthetic preferences. This is not universal determination, but it is substantial influence. Second, economic structures are not natural or inevitable. They are historical, contingent, changeable. Capitalism feels natural because it dominates our world, but it is merely one mode of production among many actual and possible modes. Third, ideologies naturalize existing power relations. They present contingent arrangements as necessary, historical constructions as eternal truths. Recognizing ideologies' material basis is crucial for critique. Fourth, humans make history under material constraints. We are not passive victims of economic forces. But neither are we free agents conjuring reality from pure thought. We act within material conditions we inherit, transform those conditions through collective action, create new conditions for future generations. Marxist materialism differs from philosophical materialism about consciousness. Marx rarely discussed whether minds are physical. He focused on how minds are shaped by society. But both share a commitment. Understanding requires explaining material causes, not invoking spirits or abstract ideas. For Marx, you cannot understand feudalism by analyzing the concept of honor. You must analyze land ownership, surplus extraction, legal compulsion. Similarly, philosophical materialists say you cannot understand minds by analyzing immaterial souls. You must analyze brains, evolution, information processing. Both reject explanations that stop at the mental or ideal. Both insist on going deeper, finding material grounds. Yet Marx's materialism also reveals materialism's political edge. Materialism has always been potentially subversive. Ancient atomists rejected divine design. Epicurus freed humans from fear of gods. La Métrie eliminated the soul. Each move threatened religious authority. Marx threatened economic authority. By showing that property relations are historical, not natural, that exploitation produces surplus value, that class conflict drives history, he gave workers theoretical tools for revolution. This is why materialism often faced suppression, not just because it challenged religious doctrine, but because it challenged power itself. If humans are just matter, then traditional justifications for hierarchy collapse. No divine right of kings, no natural aristocracy, no eternal moral order mandating submission. Just material arrangements that can be changed. Historical materialism thus reveals what is at stake in metaphysical materialism. It is not merely an abstract question about the fundamental nature of reality. It shapes how we understand society, agency, and transformation. If materialism is true, humans are material beings in material conditions. We can understand those conditions scientifically. And because we understand them, we can change them. This is materialism's emancipatory promise. Knowledge of material causes enables intervention. But it is also materialism's threat. If everything is material, then perhaps nothing is sacred, nothing beyond material manipulation. Part 6. When matter goes quantum. Just as materialism seemed to achieve dominance, physics betrayed it. 20th century physics revealed that matter is nothing like materialists imagined. Newton's universe was deterministic and mechanical. Particles had definite positions and momenta. Causation flowed forward in time according to fixed laws. This was the metaphysical foundation for materialist confidence. Then came quantum mechanics. At quantum scales, particles do not have definite properties until measured. They exist in superpositions, being in multiple states simultaneously. An electron can be in a superposition of spin-up and spin-down. A photon can be in a superposition of passing through two slits. Measurement collapses superposition to a single definite outcome. But how collapse happens remains profoundly mysterious. The Copenhagen interpretation, dominant for decades, says that quantum systems are described by wave functions specifying probabilities. When you measure, the wave function collapses randomly to one possibility. But what counts as measurement? Does it require consciousness? Eugene Wigner suggested that consciousness collapses wave functions. The universe remains in superposition until a conscious observer looks. This would make consciousness fundamental to physics. It would mean that matter depends on mind, not mind on matter. Materialism would be exactly backwards. Most physicists reject this. Measurement involves physical interaction with macroscopic apparatus, not consciousness per se. Decoherence, the loss of quantum coherence through environmental interaction, explains apparent collapse without invoking consciousness. But the measurement problem remains unsolved. We do not have consensus on what measurement is or why it produces definite outcomes. Alternative interpretations proliferate. The many worlds interpretation says wave functions never collapse. Instead, every quantum possibility realizes in a different branch of the universe. When you measure electron spin, the universe splits. In one branch you see spin up, in another branch a copy of you sees spin down. This preserves determinism, but at the cost of ontological profligacy. Every quantum event spawns countless universes. The pilot wave interpretation restores hidden variables. Particles always have definite positions, guided by a pilot wave. Measurement merely reveals pre-existing properties. Relational quantum mechanics says quantum states are relative to observers. There is no absolute state, only states relative to different perspectives. Cubism, quantum Bayesianism, treats wave functions as subjective credences, not objective descriptions. Quantum mechanics describes how rational agents should bet, not how reality is. Every interpretation faces problems, and every interpretation has different implications for materialism. If consciousness collapses wave functions, materialism is false. If quantum mechanics is fundamentally indeterministic, Laplacian determinism is false. If many worlds is true, then physical reality is vastly stranger than classical materialism imagined. Some have proposed that quantum mechanics applies to brains. Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff developed orchestrated objective reduction theory. They claim that microtubules in neurons undergo quantum processes and consciousness emerges from quantum collapse in the brain. This is highly controversial. Most neuroscientists argue that brains are too warm and wet for quantum coherence. Quantum effects decohere almost instantly at biological scales. Brain function depends on classical neural firing, not quantum computation. But quantum biology has discovered quantum effects in photosynthesis, bird navigation, enzyme catalysis. Maybe quantum processes matter more in biology than we assumed. The deeper point is that physics itself has become conceptually strange. Matter is not the simple solid stuff of mechanical materialism. Quantum field theory describes particles as excitations of underlying fields. What exists fundamentally are fields pervading all space. Electrons and quarks are temporary patterns in these fields. Space-time itself might emerge from more fundamental quantum information. Some theories suggest that reality is fundamentally informational, not material. What does materialism even mean in this context? If matter is quantum fields, and fields are excitations of space-time, and space-time is emergent from something else, what is the material base? Contemporary physicalism acknowledges this. It defines physicalism not as matter only, but as whatever physics tells us exists. If physics posits fields, physicalism includes fields. If physics posits information, physicalism includes information. This makes physicalism almost vacuous. It becomes the claim that only what exists, exists. Critics argue that physicalism has lost its content. Originally, materialism made a substantive claim that everything is matter. Now, physicalism just says everything is physical, where physical means whatever physics says. But physics keeps discovering new things. If tomorrow physics posits consciousness as fundamental, physicalism would just incorporate that. At that point, What does physicalism rule out? Neuroscience also complicates materialism. Brain imaging reveals neural correlates of consciousness. Specific brain regions activate during specific experiences. Visual experiences correlate with visual cortex activity. Decision-making correlates with prefrontal cortex activity. These correlations confirm that consciousness depends on brains, but they do not explain how brains produce consciousness. Integrated information theory, proposed by Giulio Tononi, offers a mathematical framework. Consciousness, IIT claims, is integrated information. A system is conscious to the degree it integrates information irreducibly. IIT provides a measure, phi, quantifying consciousness. It makes testable predictions about which systems are conscious. But IIT implies that consciousness is widespread. Any system that integrates information, including thermostats or photodiodes, has some degree of consciousness. This seems counterintuitive. Global workspace theory, proposed by Bernard Baars, says consciousness arises when information becomes globally accessible. Unconscious processes compete for access to a global workspace, a cortical network that broadcasts information. Whatever reaches the workspace becomes conscious. This explains the functional role of consciousness, but not its phenomenal character. Why does global accessibility feel like something? Predictive processing frameworks say brains are prediction machines. They constantly generate models predicting sensory input. Prediction errors update models. Consciousness might be the brain's best prediction about its own states. This is elegant, but leaves the hard problem untouched. Why should prediction feel like anything? Biology also matters. Evolution shaped brains. Consciousness presumably serves some function, some advantage. But what? Some argue consciousness enables flexible, context-sensitive behavior. Others suggest consciousness integrates information for unified agency. Still others propose consciousness is a social tool, allowing sophisticated modeling of other minds. None of these explains phenomenality. Why not have all these functions unconsciously, in the dark? Perhaps consciousness is a byproduct, an epiphenomenon with no function, but this seems evolutionarily implausible. Or perhaps we misunderstand consciousness. Maybe it is not a distinct feature requiring separate explanation, but intrinsic to certain physical processes. This leans toward panpsychism. Panpsychism says consciousness is fundamental, a basic feature of reality like mass or charge. Elementary particles have some minimal experience. Complex organizations produce complex consciousness. Panpsychism seems to avoid the hard problem by not requiring consciousness to emerge from non-conscious matter. Consciousness was there all along. But panpsychism faces the combination problem. How do micro-experiences combine into macro-experiences? Your neurons might each have minimal experience, but why does their combination produce your unified experience? Why does it not produce billions of separate experiences? Contemporary materialism thus fractures across scientific findings. Quantum mechanics challenges determinism. Neuroscience maps correlates, but not causation. Evolution explains function, but not phenomenality. Physics reveals that matter is informationally structured fields, not solid stuff. This does not refute materialism, but it means materialism must continually adapt. And with each adaptation, it becomes less clear what materialism even asserts. Perhaps reality is more integrated than materialism assumed. Not matter generating mind, but matter and mind as complementary aspects of one reality. Or perhaps we need new concepts altogether, concepts that transcend the matter-mind dichotomy. Part 7. The Ghost of Aboutness. Here is something every conscious being takes for granted. Your thoughts are about things. Right now you have thoughts about materialism, about philosophy, about these words. This aboutness, this directedness toward objects, is called intentionality. Franz Brentano made intentionality the mark of the mental. Mental states, and only mental states, have intentional content. Beliefs are about states of affairs. Desires are about possible outcomes. Perceptions are about objects in the environment. Physical states, by contrast, seem to lack intentionality. A rock is not about anything. A neuron firing is just electrochemical activity. It does not inherently mean or represent or refer. So how can mental states, if they are physical states, have intentionality? This is the problem of intentionality, and it poses a serious challenge to materialism. Some materialists try to naturalize intentionality through causal relations. Perhaps a mental state is about X when X causes that state in the right way. When you see a tree, photons bouncing off the tree cause visual cortex activation. Perhaps that brain state is about the tree because the tree caused it. This causal theory seems promising for perceptual states, but it immediately faces problems. First, you can think about non-existent things. You can believe in unicorns, imagine dragons, fear ghosts. But non-existent things cause nothing. So causal theories cannot explain how thoughts can be about them. Second, you can think about future events. You plan tomorrow's activities, worry about retirement, hope for technological breakthroughs. But future events do not exist yet. They cannot cause present thoughts. Third, many different causes produce the same thought. Your thought of water might be caused by seeing water, by hearing the word water, by feeling thirsty. What makes all these states about water rather than about their various causes? Fourth, misrepresentation becomes impossible. If a state is about whatever causes it, then it cannot be about the wrong thing. You hallucinate a snake. Some neural malfunction caused this visual experience. Is your experience about the neural malfunction? That seems wrong. You are hallucinating a snake, not perceiving a neuron. Teleosemantic theories try to fix this. They ground intentionality not in actual causation, but in evolutionary function. A frog's prey detection system evolved to detect flies. When it fires, it represents flies, even if triggered by a bee or a pebble. The system is about flies because detecting flies is its evolutionary function. Similarly, your visual system evolved to detect environmental objects. Even when it malfunctions, producing hallucinations, it represents objects because that is its function. This handles non-existent objects and misrepresentation, but it faces new problems. First, it implies that only products of evolution have intentionality. Artificial intelligence, if not evolved, would lack genuine intentionality. This seems implausible. Sophisticated AI systems seem to represent, process semantic content, make inferences. Second, evolution selects for reproductive success, not truth. Natural selection produces adaptive beliefs, not necessarily true beliefs. But intentionality is supposed to ground truth conditions. How can function ground truth when function and truth can diverge? Third, evolutionary functions are vague. Your visual system evolved to detect mid-sized objects at moderate distances under certain lighting conditions. But you can see stars, hallucinate, close your eyes, and visualize. What is your visual system about when doing these things? Tracking theories propose that a representation is about whatever it tracks reliably. If a neural state reliably correlates with horses, it represents horses. But this faces the disjunction problem. Your horse detector sometimes responds to cows or distant zebras. Does it represent horses, or does it represent horses, or cows, or zebras? What determines which disjunction is the content? Functional role theories ground content in inferential and behavioral connections. What makes a state mean? Water is its connections to other states. It is disposed to combine with heat to produce steam thoughts, with cold to produce ice thoughts, with thirst to produce drinking behavior. This captures the holistic nature of content. Concepts are not isolated. They exist within networks of interrelated concepts, but functional role content is too narrow. My water concept and your water concept have different functional roles. I associate water with childhood swimming. You associate it with mountain streams. Yet we both think about the same stuff, H2O. Perhaps content has two components. Narrow content determined by functional role within the head, and wide content determined by external factors. Hilary Putnam's twin Earth thought experiment motivated this. Imagine an exact duplicate of Earth, but water there is not H2O, it is XYZ. Twin Earth water looks, tastes, behaves identically to our water. You have a twin on twin Earth, molecule for molecule, identical to you. When you think water, you think about H2O. When your twin thinks water, they think about XYZ. Yet your internal states are identical. So content is not wholly determined by internal states. It depends on external environment. This is semantic externalism. Meanings are not in the head. But if meanings are not in the head, how do they explain behavior? Your behavior is caused by internal brain states. Yet those internal states do not fix content. Content is partly fixed by external factors irrelevant to causation. This threatens epiphenomenalism about content. Perhaps content does not matter to causation. Your behavior would be the same even if your thoughts meant something different, so long as internal functional states were identical. Phenomenal intentionality theorists argue that intentionality derives from consciousness. States are about things because they consciously represent things. The aboutness of belief comes from the what it is likeness of believing. This grounds intentionality in phenomenology, but it makes intentionality inexplicable on materialist terms. If consciousness is irreducible, and intentionality derives from consciousness, then intentionality is also irreducible. Language complicates matters. Words have meaning. The word tree refers to trees, but words are just sounds or marks. Physical vibrations or ink patterns do not inherently mean anything. Convention seems to ground linguistic meaning. We collectively agree that tree means trees. But this pushes the problem back. Mental states must already have intentionality to establish conventions. You cannot agree that tree means trees unless you can already think about trees. Intentionality also underlies rationality. Logical relations hold between contents. If you believe all humans are mortal and believe Socrates is human, you should believe Socrates is mortal. This is valid inference. But physical states have causal relations, not logical relations. Neuron A firing causes neuron B to fire because of physical connections. There is no physical law enforcing logical validity. How does matter obey logic? How can purely physical processes be rational or irrational? Some argue that natural selection shaped us to reason reliably. Organisms with reliable inference mechanisms survived. So rationality is grounded in evolution. But evolution produces adaptive reasoning, not necessarily sound reasoning. False beliefs can be adaptive. Overestimating danger promotes survival. Motivated reasoning protects self-esteem. If rationality is just adaptive inference, then perhaps most human reasoning is irrational by objective standards. But this seems wrong. We can recognize and correct logical errors. We can conform our beliefs to evidence. This normative dimension seems irreducible. The problem of intentionality thus connects to consciousness, normativity, and meaning. All three resist materialist explanation. Dennett argues that intentionality is a useful fiction. We adopt the intentional stance, treating systems as if they have beliefs and desires, because this predicts behavior. But there are no real beliefs and desires, just as there are no real colors or qualia. Critics respond that this eliminates too much. If beliefs do not exist, then the belief that beliefs do not exist does not exist. The position refutes itself. Others argue that intentionality is primitive, irreducible, inexplicable. It is simply a brute fact that mental states have content. But this abandons the materialist project. Materialism promised to explain everything in physical terms. If intentionality is primitive and non-physical, materialism has failed. Perhaps intentionality is not a distinct feature requiring separate explanation. Perhaps it is intrinsic to certain information processing structures. When systems reach sufficient complexity and integration, they inherently represent. But why? What is it about complexity that generates aboutness? The explanatory gap looms again. Intentionality haunts materialism like a ghost. It seems to show that minds have properties utterly unlike physical properties. Thoughts reach beyond themselves to absent objects, non-existent entities, abstract structures. Matter cannot do that. Atoms just are where they are. Unless aboutness is illusion, unless representation is a convenient fiction we project onto causal systems. Unless minds do not really think about anything, but that seems absurd. Right now, undeniably, you are thinking about intentionality. Or are you? Part 8. The Realm Beyond Matter. Numbers exist. 2 + 2 = 4. The Pythagorean theorem is true. But where do numbers exist? Not in physical space. You cannot point to the number 7 or weigh a circle. Mathematical objects seem to inhabit a different realm entirely. This is the problem of abstract objects, and it threatens materialism at its foundations. Plato argued that abstract forms are more real than material particulars. The perfect circle exists eternally in the realm of forms. Physical circles are merely imperfect approximations, shadows of the true circle. For Plato, mathematics reveals the structure of ultimate reality. When you grasp a mathematical truth, you're accessing the form directly through reason. Matter is derivative, secondary, less real. Materialism inverts this. It says matter is fundamental, and abstract objects must somehow be explained materialistically or eliminated. But mathematical truths seem independent of material reality. Even if the universe contained no physical triangles, the angles of triangles would still sum to 180 degrees. Mathematical truths seem necessary, true in all possible worlds. How can materialism account for this? Mathematical nominalism denies that abstract objects exist. Numbers, sets, functions are useful fictions. When we say 7 is prime, we are not referring to some abstract entity. We are making a claim about how the number words work in our language. This avoids positing immaterial objects, but it struggles to explain mathematical truth. If numbers do not exist, how can statements about them be true? And mathematics seems to describe real patterns. You cannot arrange 7 objects into equal rows without remainder. That is a fact about reality, not just language. Fictionalism says mathematical statements are like statements in novels. When we say Sherlock Holmes lives on Baker Street, we are not asserting literal truth. We are saying that, according to the fiction, Holmes lives there. Similarly, when we say the square root of 2 is irrational, we mean, according to mathematical fiction, it is irrational. But mathematics is not arbitrary like fiction. Authors can make Holmes any age. But mathematicians cannot make the square root of 2 rational. Mathematical truths are discovered, not invented. Structuralism says mathematics studies structures, not objects. Numbers are not things, but positions in structures. 7 is not an object but a structural role, the 7th position in the natural number sequence. This reduces ontological commitment. We need not posit the number 7 as a thing. We need only recognize numerical structure. but structures seem just as abstract as numbers. What is structure if not a pattern of relations? And patterns seem to be abstract objects themselves. Perhaps mathematics is about physical structures. Sets are collections of physical objects. Functions are physical mappings. Numbers are properties of physical collections. But this makes mathematical truth contingent on physical facts. If the universe contained only finitely many objects, there would be no infinite sets. Yet infinity seems mathematically coherent regardless of physical reality. Moreover, mathematics applies beyond its physical origins. We use calculus for continuous functions, but reality might be discrete. We use infinite sets, but the universe might be finite. Mathematics has an unreasonable effectiveness, as Eugene Wigner put it. It applies to reality far beyond its apparent physical grounding. Some argue that mathematics is mental construction. Humans create mathematical objects through cognitive activity. Numbers are ideas, products of counting and abstraction, but this makes mathematical truth subjective. Did pi's digits exist before humans calculated them? It seems they did. Discovering pi's millionth digit reveals something already true, not something just created. Perhaps mathematical truth is about what follows from axioms. Given Peano axioms, certain theorems follow. Mathematical truth is logical consequence, not correspondence to abstract objects. This avoids commitment to mathematical objects. But axioms themselves seem to have mathematical content. Why accept some axioms and not others? Because some axioms correctly capture mathematical structure, and structure seems abstract again. The problem deepens with moral values. Some actions are wrong. Torturing innocents for pleasure is wrong. This seems objectively true, not merely opinion. But if materialism is true, what makes actions right or wrong? Matter has no moral properties. Particles are neither good nor evil. They simply move according to natural laws. Moral naturalism tries to reduce moral properties to natural properties. Perhaps good means pleasure or preference satisfaction. Perhaps wrong means harmful. But G. E. Moore's open question argument challenges this. For any natural property n, we can meaningfully ask whether n is good. Even if pleasure typically is good, we can coherently question whether pleasure is always good. This suggests goodness is not identical to any natural property. Moreover, natural properties are descriptive, while moral properties are normative. Descriptive facts tell us what is. Normative facts tell us what ought to be. David Hume noted that you cannot derive ought from is. No amount of descriptive facts entails evaluative conclusions. If materialism is true, only descriptive facts exist. So moral facts cannot exist. Moral error theory embraces this conclusion. J. L. Mackie argued that ordinary moral discourse presupposes objective values. But objective values do not exist. Therefore, all moral judgments are false. When you say torture is wrong, you are asserting that torture has the property of wrongness. But nothing has such properties. Your moral belief is an error. This seems deeply counterintuitive. The wrongness of torture seems as certain as anything. If materialism requires denying this, materialism seems flawed. Expressivism tries to salvage morality without moral facts. Moral utterances do not assert facts, but express attitudes. Saying torture is wrong does not describe torture. It expresses disapproval, like saying boo to torture. This avoids commitment to moral properties, but it struggles to explain moral reasoning. We make moral arguments, inferences. We recognize consistency and inconsistency. But if moral claims merely express emotions, how can they stand in logical relations? Constructivism grounds morality in agreement or rational consensus. What is right is what we would agree to under ideal conditions. Morality is constructed by rational agents, not discovered. But this makes morality contingent on agreement. If rational agents agreed that torture was acceptable, would it become right? This seems wrong. Torture would remain wrong regardless of agreement. Perhaps evolutionary ethics explains moral intuitions. Natural selection shaped us to feel that fairness matters, that harm is wrong, that cooperation is valuable. These feelings promoted group cohesion and survival. But evolutionary explanations debunk rather than vindicate morality. If we believe harm is wrong only because such beliefs were adaptive, not because harm actually is wrong, then our moral beliefs are unreliable. Evolution selected for survival, not truth. Street's Darwinian dilemma presses this point. Either moral truths influenced evolution, or they did not. If they influenced evolution, they somehow causally affected selective pressures, which seems impossible for abstract moral facts. If they did not influence evolution, then our moral beliefs are evolutionary accidents, unrelated to moral truth. Either way, we have no reason to trust our moral intuitions. Then there is aesthetic value. Sunsets are beautiful. Mozart's music is sublime. These seem like genuine truths about value. But photons reflected off atmospheric particles have no aesthetic properties. Sound waves have no inherent beauty. Beauty, on materialist grounds, must be subjective response, not objective feature. Yet aesthetic judgments feel objective. We debate whether artworks are good. We recognize expertise. We distinguish refined from crude taste. This suggests aesthetic value is more than mere preference. Materialists must either explain how values emerge from matter or eliminate values as illusions. Neither option is attractive. Perhaps normativity is simply inexplicable on materialist terms. Perhaps the normative and the descriptive are fundamentally different domains. But if materialism cannot explain normativity, it cannot explain rationality. Believing consistently, reasoning validly, updating on evidence, all involve norms. You should not contradict yourself. You should believe what the evidence supports. These are not just descriptions of how we happen to think. They are standards we ought to meet. If materialism eliminates normativity, it eliminates the grounds for rational belief, including rational belief in materialism itself. This is the self-defeating character of eliminative materialism. If all normative claims are false, then the claim that we should believe materialism is false. If there are no reasons, there is no reason to be a materialist. Some materialists bite this bullet. They accept that rationality, morality, meaning, all are in some sense illusory. We are matter doing what matter does. Our sense that we have reasons that we respond to norms is a cognitive illusion produced by evolution. But this position seems pragmatically incoherent. You cannot live as if reasons do not exist while giving reasons for materialism. Abstract objects, mathematical truths, moral values, aesthetic properties, rational norms all resist materialist reduction. They seem to inhabit a different ontological category than matter. Platonists embrace this, positing a realm of abstract entities. Materialists reject it, insisting that only matter exists. But rejecting abstract entities requires explaining away powerful intuitions about necessity, objectivity, and normativity. And those explanations often seem more costly than the problems they solve. Part 9. Where the foundation cracks. Every philosophical position faces objections. But materialism faces objections that strike at its very coherence. Let us inventory the major challenges, the places where materialism seems to fail most dramatically. First, the irreducibility of consciousness. We have discussed this extensively, but its importance cannot be overstated. Materialism promises to explain everything in physical terms, yet after centuries of trying, no one has produced a remotely convincing materialist account of phenomenal experience. Every proposed reduction leaves out the very thing it is supposed to explain. Functional analyses explain behavior, but not felt quality. Neural correlates map correlations, but not why correlation exists. Evolutionary accounts explain adaptive value, but not subjective character. The explanatory gap persists, and many philosophers now believe it is unbridgeable. Not because we are ignorant, but because the conceptual resources of materialism are inadequate. Thomas Nagel argues that materialism is a view from nowhere, attempting to understand reality purely objectively. But consciousness is inherently perspectival. There is something it is like to be me, but not something it is like to be a rock. This first-person ontology cannot be captured by third-person description. Colin McGinn suggests we are cognitively closed to the solution. Just as dogs cannot understand calculus, we cannot understand how matter produces consciousness. Our concepts and cognitive architecture prevent us from grasping the connection. But if materialism requires understanding we cannot achieve, what grounds belief in materialism? Second, the problem of free will and moral responsibility. If materialism is true, your actions are determined by prior physical states plus natural laws. Every decision you make is the inevitable result of brain states you did not choose. Those brain states resulted from earlier brain states, which resulted from genetic and environmental factors. Trace the causal chain back far enough, and you reach causes entirely beyond your control. Where in this deterministic process is freedom? Where is the genuine possibility to have done otherwise? Some materialists embrace compatibilism. Freedom, they argue, does not require exemption from causation. You are free when you act according to your desires without external constraint. Even if desires are determined, they are still yours, and acting on them constitutes freedom. But this seems to evade the real problem. If your desires are determined by factors beyond your control, how are you responsible for actions flowing from them? A murderer's desires were shaped by genes and environment. On what grounds do we hold them responsible? Moral responsibility seems to require ultimate sourcehood. You must be the ultimate source of your actions, not merely a link in a causal chain. But materialism cannot provide ultimate sourcehood. The ultimate source of your actions is the Big Bang plus physical laws. Some argue we should eliminate moral responsibility. Neuroscientist Sam Harris claims free will is an illusion. We are biological machines executing genetic and environmental programming. Blame and praise are incoherent, but eliminative this seems to undermine social order and human relationships. Our entire legal system, our practices of punishment and reward, our interpersonal responses of gratitude and resentment all presuppose responsibility. Can we simply abandon these? And if no one is responsible, then materialists are not responsible for their arguments. Their belief in materialism is just causal output, not rationally justified conclusion. Third, the problem of mental causation. Your mental states seem to cause behavior. You want coffee, so you get coffee. You believe the store closes at 6, so you leave by 5:30. Desires and beliefs explain actions. But if mental states are physical states, their causal powers are already accounted for by physics. The physical properties of brain states causally suffice to produce behavior. What causal work is left for mental properties? This is the exclusion problem. If physics causally explains everything physical, mental properties are either identical to physical properties or causally irrelevant. Identity theory makes mental properties causally efficacious by identifying them with physical properties. But we have seen that identity theory faces severe problems. Non-reductive materialism insists mental properties are distinct but supervene on physical properties. Yet, if they are distinct and everything physical has sufficient physical causes, mental properties become epiphenomenal. They exist but do nothing. Some argue for top-down causation. Higher-level properties constrain lower-level processes. But constraints seem to be just more physical facts. Where is the distinctively mental causation? Fourth, the problem of emergence. Materialists often invoke emergence to explain how complex systems have properties their components lack. Water is wet, though H2O molecules are not. Consciousness emerges from neurons, though neurons are not conscious. But emergence comes in two types. Weak emergence is just unexpected complexity arising from simple rules. Flocking behavior in birds emerges from simple individual rules, yet flocking is fully explicable in terms of those rules. Strong emergence involves properties genuinely novel, not reducible to base-level properties plus interactions. Consciousness seems to require strong emergence. But strong emergence is conceptually mysterious on materialist grounds. How can matter organized differently produce properties not implicit in matter itself? If consciousness strongly emerges from matter, materialism has not really explained consciousness. It has merely labeled the mystery emergence. Fifth, the problem of unity. Physical systems are decomposable into parts. A brain is neurons, which are cells, which are molecules, which are atoms. At every level, we can analyze systems into components, but consciousness is unified. Your experience is not a collection of separate micro-experiences. It is one integrated phenomenal field. How does matter, which is inherently divisible, produce something indivisible? This is the unity problem, and it connects to the binding problem discussed earlier. Some propose that quantum entanglement provides unity. If brain processes involve quantum coherence, perhaps entangled states ground phenomenal unity. But this is highly speculative, and it is unclear how quantum mechanics would help, even if applicable. Sixth, the problem of private knowledge. You have direct access to your own mental states in a way no one else does. You know immediately whether you are in pain. Others must infer your pain from behavior. This asymmetry between first-person and third-person access seems incompatible with materialism. If mental states are just brain states, why should they be known differently from within? Why does introspection reveal different properties than neuroscience? Materialists argue that different access modes reveal the same states. But this does not explain why introspection feels so different. When you introspect pain, you do not seem to be detecting neural firing. You seem to be accessing a qualitatively distinct domain. Seventh, the problem of semantic indeterminacy. Physical states are precise. Neural firing rates are exact quantities. But mental content often seems vague. Do you believe all bachelors are unmarried, or only typical bachelors? Is your concept chair precise or fuzzy? If content were determinate physical fact, this indeterminacy would not exist. Perhaps content is not determinate. Perhaps beliefs have no precise boundaries. But this seems wrong phenomenologically. Your beliefs seem definite to you. Eighth, the problem of rationality. Materialism explains mental states causally, but rationality involves normative relations between contents. Beliefs should cohere, inferences should be valid. These oughts seem irreducible to causal relationships. Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism presses this. If our cognitive faculties are products of evolution optimizing for survival, not truth, we have no reason to trust them. Evolution produces adaptive beliefs, even if false. Believing tigers are dangerous promotes survival, whether or not the belief is true. So, if materialism is true, our cognitive faculties are unreliable. But then belief in materialism is unreliable. Materialism undermines itself. Ninth, the problem of theoretical virtues. Materialists appeal to simplicity, elegance, unification. Materialism is simpler than dualism because it posits only one kind of substance. But these theoretical virtues are normative. Why should reality be simple? Why prefer unified explanations over disunified ones? These preferences reflect aesthetic and pragmatic values, not features materialism can ground. If materialism is true, perhaps complex, messy, disunified reality is most likely. Our preference for simplicity is merely cognitive bias. 10th, the problem of non-physical causation. Materialism denies non-physical causation. But mathematics, logic, reasons themselves seem to causally constrain beliefs. You believe the Pythagorean theorem because it is true, because the proof compels assent. This looks like abstract objects causally affecting concrete minds, but materialism denies that abstract objects exist or have causal powers. Perhaps mathematical beliefs are caused by brain states, not mathematical truths. But then, why do beliefs track mathematical truths? The correlation seems inexplicable. Each of these problems admits some materialist response, but the responses are often strained, counterintuitive, or lead to further problems. And cumulatively, the problems suggest that materialism is not merely incomplete, but fundamentally misguided. It is trying to cram reality into a conceptual framework too narrow to contain it. Critics like David Chalmers, Thomas Nagel, Alvin Plantinga and others argue that we need to move beyond materialism, not back to substance dualism with its interaction problems, but forward to some new framework that accommodates both physical and mental aspects of reality. What that framework might be remains disputed, but the case against materialism has never been stronger. Part 10. Beyond the dichotomy. If materialism fails, what replaces it? The 21st century has seen an explosion of alternative frameworks attempting to transcend the mind-matter divide. Panpsychism, once dismissed as mystical nonsense, has gained surprising traction among serious philosophers. The basic idea is simple. Consciousness is not something that emerges from unconscious matter at some threshold of complexity. Consciousness is fundamental, present at all levels of reality. Even electrons have some minimal form of experience. Not thought or perception, but perhaps something like bare sensitivity or proto-phenomenality. As matter organizes into more complex structures, consciousness becomes more complex. Atoms have richer experience than electrons. Cells have richer experience than atoms. Brains have vastly richer experience than cells. Philip Goff defends panpsychism as the best solution to the hard problem. If micro-level entities have micro-experiences, then macro-experience is not emerging from nothing but combining from something. This avoids the brute emergence problem. Consciousness does not suddenly appear when matter reaches some threshold. It was there all along. But panpsychism faces the combination problem. Even if electrons are conscious, why does combining electrons produce unified human consciousness rather than a collection of electron consciousnesses? Your brain contains roughly 100 billion neurons, each containing trillions of atoms. If each atom is conscious, that is an astronomical number of micro-subjects. How do they become one subject you? This is not obviously harder than the emergence problem materialism faces, but it remains unsolved. Constitutive panpsychism says macro-consciousness is constituted by micro-consciousnesses. Emergent panpsychism says macro-consciousness emerges from micro-consciousness. Priority monism says the cosmos as a whole is fundamentally conscious, and parts derive their consciousness from the whole. Each variant faces technical challenges. But panpsychism's core insight that consciousness is fundamental rather than derivative increasingly seems necessary. Neutral monism offers a different approach. Rather than matter producing mind or mind producing matter, both are aspects of a more fundamental reality. Bertrand Russell and William James defended versions of this. Russell suggested that physics describes matter's relational structure, but not its intrinsic nature. Perhaps matter's intrinsic nature is experiential. Physical properties are how matter appears from outside. Phenomenal properties are how it appears from inside. This is sometimes called Russellian monism. It makes physics and phenomenology complementary rather than competing descriptions. Neutral monism dissolves the mind-matter problem by denying both are fundamental. Instead, some neutral stuff, neither mental nor physical as usually conceived, grounds both domains. But what is this neutral stuff, and how does positing it help? If we cannot characterize it except negatively, we have not really explained anything. Idealism takes the opposite approach from materialism. Instead of reducing mind to matter, it reduces matter to mind. Bishop Berkeley famously argued that to be is to be perceived. Objects exist only when perceived. The table in your room exists because you or God perceives it. Remove all perceivers and nothing physical exists. This solves the hard problem trivially. If reality is fundamentally mental, consciousness does not emerge from matter. Matter emerges from or within consciousness. Contemporary analytic idealism, defended by Bernardo Kastrup, offers a more sophisticated version. Kastrup argues that reality is one cosmic consciousness. Individual minds are dissociated alters of this universal mind, like multiple personalities in one subject. Physical reality is the appearance of mental processes viewed from outside. Your brain is what your mental activity looks like from an external perspective. This is elegant in some ways. It explains why consciousness correlates with brains without identifying consciousness with brain activity. Brain activity is consciousness viewed objectively, but idealism struggles to explain the apparent independence of physical reality. Why does matter behave according to fixed laws if it is just mental appearance? Why can we predict physical events without knowing mental states? Idealists respond that mental processes have structure and that structure appears as physical law. But this requires substantial metaphysical commitments about cosmic minds that seem as mysterious as materialism's consciousness emergence. Dual aspect theory, another alternative, says mind and matter are two aspects of one underlying reality. Like two sides of a coin, neither reducible to the other. Spinoza's 17th century philosophy exemplifies this. God, or nature, is the one substance. Mind and matter are two attributes of this substance, two ways the one reality manifests. Every physical state has a corresponding mental aspect, and vice versa. They run in perfect parallel without causal interaction. Modern dual-aspect theories, like those of Thomas Nagel and David Chalmers in some moods, propose that phenomenal and physical properties are irreducibly distinct, yet necessarily correlated. Bridge laws connect them, but neither explains the other. This avoids reductionism in either direction, but it leaves the correlation unexplained. Why should physical and phenomenal run together? What enforces the bridge laws? Information-theoretic approaches suggest information is fundamental. Both matter and mind are ways information is organized. Physicist John Wheeler proposed it from bit, that physical existence emerges from information. Quantum mechanics describes information states, not material substances. Some extend this to consciousness. Perhaps consciousness is information integrated in certain ways. Integrated information theory mentioned earlier takes this route, but information seems abstract. How can abstract information be fundamental? And why should information integration feel like anything? Process philosophy, inspired by Alfred North Whitehead, rejects the substance metaphysics underlying both materialism and idealism. Reality is not made of things, but of events and processes. Consciousness is not a substance or property, but an ongoing process. So is matter. Both are dynamic, relational, evolving. This avoids static substance dualism while accommodating both mental and physical aspects. But process philosophy's technical complexity has limited its influence. Enactivism, developed by Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson and others, emphasizes embodied cognition. Mind is not in the brain, but in brain-body environment loops. Consciousness emerges from dynamic coupling between organism and world. It cannot be understood by studying brains in isolation. This resonates with phenomenology's emphasis on lived experience and being in the world. But whether enactivism solves the hard problem or merely postpones it remains debated. Some philosophers embrace Mysterianism, accepting that consciousness may be permanently inexplicable. We should acknowledge ignorance rather than forcing inadequate explanations. Colin McGinn argues we are cognitively close to the solution. Our concepts cannot grasp how matter produces consciousness, not because no explanation exists, but because we lack the cognitive architecture to understand it. This is intellectually honest, but deeply unsatisfying. If we cannot solve the problem, why do philosophy at all? What emerges from surveying alternatives is that no position is trouble-free. Every framework has costs. Materialism struggles with consciousness, intentionality, and normativity. Dualism struggles with interaction and parsimony. Panpsychism struggles with combination. Idealism struggles with physical independence. Neutral monism struggles with characterizing the neutral. Perhaps the mind-matter problem is not solvable because the question is malformed. Perhaps mind and matter are not natural kinds, but historically contingent concepts that do not carve reality at its joints. Or perhaps we need radically new concepts. Medieval philosophers could not solve astronomy with geocentric concepts. Heliocentrism required conceptual revolution. Similarly, consciousness studies might require concepts we do not yet possess. Concepts that make the current problem dissolve, rather than solving it within current frameworks. The move beyond materialism is thus ongoing, uncertain, contested, but few contemporary philosophers defend crude mechanical materialism anymore. The question is not whether materialism as originally conceived is true, it almost certainly is not, but what replaces it. And that question remains profoundly open. Part 11. Living with or without matter. Philosophy is not just abstract theorizing. Metaphysical commitments have practical implications. If materialism is true, how should we live? What follows for ethics, meaning, purpose, human relationships? Start with ethics. If humans are just matter, complexly arranged but ultimately just particles following physical laws, what grounds moral obligation? Materialists respond that morality does not require non-physical foundations. Evolution shaped us to cooperate, feel empathy, value fairness. These pro-social emotions enabled group living and enhanced survival. Morality emerges from these evolved tendencies, plus rational reflection. We can recognize that causing suffering is bad without positing objective moral facts in some Platonic realm. Sam Harris argues that morality concerns well-being. Facts about well-being are scientific facts. Neuroscience can identify what promotes or diminishes well-being. Therefore, ethics can be grounded materialistically in brain science. But critics respond that this confuses is and ought. Even if we can measure well-being scientifically, why should we promote it? Why is well-being valuable? This normative question cannot be answered by empirical facts alone. Moreover, evolutionary debunking arguments undermine confidence in moral intuitions. If we believe fairness matters only because such beliefs were adaptive, not because fairness actually matters, then our moral beliefs are unreliable. Some materialists embrace moral fictionalism or error theory. Morality is useful fiction that stabilizes society. We should act as if moral facts exist, even knowing they do not, because moral behavior promotes flourishing. But can we genuinely commit to morality while believing it is fiction? Can judges sentence criminals while believing blame is incoherent? Can parents teach children morality while thinking moral obligations are illusions? This seems psychologically difficult, if not impossible. What about meaning and purpose? If materialism is true, the universe has no inherent meaning. It is just matter and energy evolving according to blind physical laws. Eventually, the stars will burn out, black holes will evaporate, and nothing will remain. Materialist philosophers respond that meaning is constructed, not discovered. We create meaning through projects, relationships, achievements. The fact that no cosmic purpose exists does not prevent us from having purposes. Albert Camus captured this in his essay The Myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus eternally rolls a boulder up a mountain, only to watch it roll back down. His task is objectively meaningless. Yet Camus imagines Sisyphus happy, finding meaning in the struggle itself. We must imagine ourselves happy. We create meaning in an absurd universe. But this seems to trivialize meaning. If meaning is just subjective projection, why prefer one project over another? Why is building hospitals more meaningful than collecting bottle caps? Without objective standards, meaning threatens to collapse into arbitrary preference. What about death? If materialism is true, death is annihilation. Your consciousness is brain activity, and when your brain dies, you cease entirely. No afterlife, no reincarnation, no survival in any form. Epicurus argued this should comfort rather than frighten. Death is nothing to you, because when death exists, you do not, and when you exist, death does not. You will never experience being dead. This logic is sound, yet death anxiety persists. We fear not the experience of death, but the termination of experience, the loss of all future possibilities. Some find materialist mortality liberating. It makes life precious. Since this is your only existence, make it count. No second chances, no do-overs in another life. Others find it devastating. Everything you accomplish will eventually be erased. Everyone you love will die. All human achievements will be forgotten when the sun engulfs Earth. Nietzsche confronted this with radical honesty. If God is dead, if materialism is true, we must create new values. The overman does not despair at meaninglessness, but affirms life joyfully, despite its absurdity. But this requires psychological strength many lack. What about love and relationships? If materialism is true, love is neurochemistry. Oxytocin, dopamine, attachment circuits evolved for pair bonding. Does knowing this diminish love's significance? When you look at your child or partner, should you think here is a collection of atoms that evolution programmed me to care about? Some argue that materialist understanding enriches appreciation. It is amazing that matter can organize itself to feel love. The fact that love has physical basis does not make it less real or valuable. Others worry that materialist reduction cheapens human experience. Love is not just chemistry, they insist. It involves meaning, commitment, something transcendent. This connects to debates about artificial intelligence. If consciousness is purely material, then, in principle, we can build conscious machines. Sufficiently sophisticated AI would have genuine experiences, genuine understanding. But if consciousness is not material, AI might be mere simulation. Behaviorally indistinguishable from humans, but internally dark. This matters for AI rights. Should conscious machines have moral status? Should we treat them as persons or tools? Materialism also affects medicine and neuroscience applications. If mental illness is brain dysfunction, we should treat it with drugs or surgery. Brain interventions become ethically simpler. Deep brain stimulation for depression, memory enhancement drugs, cognitive performance enhancers, all become acceptable if minds are just brains. We are just adjusting machinery. But if consciousness transcends brain states, then brain interventions raise deeper ethical questions. Are we treating illness or altering selfhood? Criminal justice depends on these metaphysics too. If determinism is true, punishment as retribution makes no sense. Criminals could not have done otherwise. They are victims of biology and circumstance. Some materialists advocate rehabilitative rather than retributive justice. Treat criminals as we treat medical patients, attempting cure, not punishment. Others argue that consequentialist justifications for punishment survive determinism. Punishment deters crime and protects society, regardless of metaphysical freedom. But our emotional responses, our anger at wrongdoing, our sense that offenders deserve suffering seem to presuppose incompatibilist freedom. Can we maintain moral emotions while rejecting their metaphysical presuppositions? Education changes under materialism. If learning is neuroplasticity, education becomes brain training. Perhaps pharmacological or electrical enhancement should supplement traditional teaching. But if minds are not reducible to brains, education must cultivate something beyond neural circuits. Character, wisdom, understanding, qualities that resist materialist reduction. Religion and spirituality face obvious challenges. If materialism is true, religious experience is just brain activity. Mystical states are neural states. Prayer does not reach beyond material reality. Some naturalistic Buddhists embrace this. Meditation is brain training. Enlightenment is recognizing the self's illusoriness. Buddhism becomes psychology without metaphysics. But traditional religious commitments, personal gods, souls, afterlives, miracles, all conflict with strict materialism. You can be materialist or religious, but not both. Unless you embrace what Owen Flanagan calls really minimal religion, retaining practices and community while abandoning supernatural metaphysics. Human dignity also depends on metaphysics. If humans are just matter, what makes us special? Other animals are matter too. Complex AI would be matter. Perhaps nothing makes humans special. Perhaps we should extend moral consideration to all sentient beings, biological or artificial. Or perhaps human uniqueness lies in some non-physical feature, rationality or spirituality or moral agency that grounds dignity. But materialism denies such features exist. These practical implications show what is at stake beyond abstract metaphysics. Materialism, if true, reshapes how we understand ourselves and organize society. Some find this exhilarating. Free from religious dogma and metaphysical confusion, we can build rational ethics and just institutions. Others find it horrifying. Materialism strips life of transcendent meaning and reduces persons to matter. But perhaps the truth matters more than comfort. If materialism is true, we must accept it regardless of implications. And if materialism is false, we must reject it regardless of how comforting it might be. The question remains, what is the truth? Part 12. The Unresolved Question. We have journeyed through 25 centuries of materialist thought, from Democritus's atoms to quantum fields, from Lamettrie's machine to computational theories of mind, from Marx's historical materialism to contemporary neuroscience. What have we learned? First, materialism is not one doctrine, but a family of positions. They share a core commitment that reality is fundamentally physical, but they differ radically in details. Identity theory, functionalism, eliminative materialism, non-reductive physicalism, these are not minor variations, but fundamentally different views with different implications. Second, materialism has extraordinary explanatory power in many domains. Physics, chemistry, biology, neuroscience, all advance by seeking material mechanisms. This methodological materialism has been fantastically successful. Diseases once attributed to demons we now cure with drugs. Phenomena once considered miraculous we now reproduce in laboratories. Every success reinforces the materialist research program. When consciousness correlates perfectly with brain states, when mental illness responds to chemical intervention, when AI exhibits intelligent behavior, materialism seems vindicated. Yet, third, materialism faces persistent conceptual problems that centuries of sophisticated philosophy have not resolved. The hard problem of consciousness remains hard. Intentionality resists naturalization. Normativity cannot be grounded in descriptive facts. Mathematical and moral truths seem independent of material reality. These are not merely current ignorance, they appear to be conceptual barriers. No amount of neuroscience, no matter how complete, seems capable of explaining why neural activity feels like anything. The explanatory gap is not ignorance, but a limit of materialist concepts. Fourth, quantum mechanics and contemporary physics have undermined simple mechanical materialism. Matter is not solid stuff, but quantum fields. Reality at fundamental levels is strange, probabilistic, possibly consciousness-involving. What counts as physical has expanded so much that physicalism might accommodate almost anything. This flexibility helps materialism survive empirical challenges, but weakens its content. If physicalism just means whatever physics says exists, it becomes nearly vacuous. Fifth, alternatives to materialism have become more sophisticated and respectable. Panpsychism, idealism, neutral monism, dual aspect theory all offer frameworks that take consciousness seriously without reducing it to matter. None is problem-free, but neither is materialism. The choice between frameworks increasingly seems to depend on which problems you find more tolerable. Do you accept the hard problem and mental causation troubles of materialism? Or do you accept the combination problem of panpsychism, the independence problem of idealism, the characterization problem of neutral monism? Sixth, materialism has been politically and culturally significant beyond its truth or falsity. It has been a tool for challenging religious authority, for critiquing social hierarchies, for naturalizing humanity. Historical materialism reshaped politics. Scientific materialism reshaped medicine and psychology. Opposition to materialism often reflects not philosophical disagreement, but anxiety about materialism's implications. If materialism is true, God might not exist. Souls might be illusions. Morality might lack foundations. These implications threaten deeply held beliefs and social structures. So, where does this leave us? If you force me to bet, I would say materialism as traditionally conceived is probably false. Not crude mechanical materialism, which is certainly false, but even sophisticated contemporary materialism. The combination of persistent explanatory failures, the resilience of anti-materialist arguments, the availability of alternative frameworks, all suggest materialism has reached its limits. But I would also say that whatever replaces materialism must preserve its key insights. Consciousness depends on brains. Mental states have physical correlates. Methodological naturalism succeeds in science. Any adequate theory must explain these facts. You cannot simply dismiss neuroscience and retreat to substance dualism. Perhaps reality is more unified than either materialists or dualists imagine. Perhaps the mental-physical distinction is not a deep metaphysical divide, but an artifact of our concepts. Russellian monism suggests something like this. Physics describes structural relations, leaving intrinsic nature unspecified. Perhaps that intrinsic nature is experiential. Then physical and phenomenal are not different stuffs, but different ways of accessing one reality. Or perhaps information is fundamental, and both matter and mind are patterns in information. This would make physics and phenomenology complementary descriptions of information structures. Or perhaps process philosophy is right, and we should abandon substance metaphysics entirely. Reality is process, flow, becoming. Both matter and mind are abstractions from ongoing events. What seems clear is that simple materialism, the view that reality is just matter as classically conceived, is inadequate. But what precise view should replace it remains deeply uncertain. This uncertainty is not failure. It is honest recognition of profound difficulty. The mind-body problem has persisted for millennia because it is genuinely hard. We have made progress. We have ruled out crude versions of both materialism and dualism. We understand the problems better than previous generations. We have more sophisticated concepts and more empirical data. But we have not solved the problem, and we may never solve it, at least not in terms currently available. Perhaps the next conceptual revolution, comparable to heliocentrism or evolution or quantum mechanics, will finally dissolve the problem. Perhaps consciousness studies in 2150 will look back at current debates as confused category errors. Or perhaps the problem is genuinely insolvable for beings like us. Perhaps we lack the cognitive capacity to grasp how consciousness relates to matter. Either way, materialism has been an immensely fruitful philosophical program. Even if ultimately false, it has driven scientific progress and clarified issues. The attempt to explain everything materialistically has revealed both how much can be explained physically and where physical explanations reach their limits. Those limits are where philosophy becomes essential. Science proceeds materialistically by methodological necessity. It studies measurable, publicly accessible phenomena. But consciousness, intentionality, normativity all resist this approach. Philosophy must confront what science cannot measure, not by abandoning reason for mysticism, but by rigorous conceptual analysis. This is why consciousness studies needs both neuroscience and philosophy. Neuroscience maps, correlates. Philosophy asks what correlation means. Both are necessary, neither sufficient. What you do with all this depends on you. If you are drawn to materialism's parsimony and explanatory unity, work on solving the hard problem. Find ways to bridge the explanatory gap or show why it is illusory. If you find materialist reductions unconvincing, develop alternative frameworks. Make panpsychism or neutral monism or idealism into detailed research programs. If you think the whole debate is confused, propose new concepts that transcend it. What you should not do is ignore the problem. Consciousness is real. Intentionality is real. Normativity is real. Any adequate worldview must account for them. Materialism is one attempt, a powerful, influential, deeply problematic attempt. Whether it ultimately succeeds or fails, the materialist tradition has forced us to think rigorously about the hardest questions. What are we? What is the world made of? How do mind and matter relate? These questions defined ancient philosophy. They define contemporary philosophy. They will define future philosophy. Because as long as there are conscious beings wondering about reality, the mystery of consciousness itself remains. The question of how mere matter could produce the vivid immediacy of experience. Materialism says it did. Critics say it cannot. The debate continues. The mystery remains. And that is where we must leave it, not with answers, but with deepened questions. Not with certainty, but with rigorous uncertainty. The truth about materialism, about consciousness, about the fundamental nature of reality, still waits to be discovered. Or perhaps waits to be created, or perhaps was never lost at all.